Are viewers ready to learn the truth about the hidden side of life in the luxurious mansions of the past? Behind the gleaming facades of Victorian estates lay a harsh reality for the servants. Heat in these enormous houses was a strict privilege, reserved exclusively for the aristocracy. The servants' workrooms and bedrooms were almost never heated. The massive stone mansions of that era were veritable ice traps during the winter months. The architecture of the buildings, with their high ceilings and long open corridors, did nothing to help retain heat. While the masters enjoyed the warmth of the fireplaces in their living rooms, the servants spent the entire day in damp and freezing rooms. Every morning for the staff began in the icy silence of the basements or attics. The cold followed the servants literally at every turn throughout the entire workday. Kitchen workers could still warm themselves by the stoves, but maids and footmen were constantly moving up and down unheated staircases. Even the water in the wash basins in the servants' quarters often froze over overnight. The health of the working class was constantly put to the test due to drastic temperature fluctuations. Watch the video to the end to find out how servants survived the constant cold of wealthy homes. What lies behind the beautiful facade of the grand halls completely changes our perception of the era. Victorian architects deliberately designed homes to separate the servants from the masters. The building's layout involved a clear division into warm and cold zones. The owners' rooms were always located on the sunny side, featuring massive fireplaces. The servants' quarters were placed in the northern part of the building or hidden in the basements. The corridors for the staff were built narrow and dark. Windows in these passageways were often absent or tiny. Because of this, an icy draft blew through them year-round. Stone floors further drew the last remnants of heat from the air. The servants had to constantly move through these icy arteries of the house. The kitchen was the only relatively warm place on the lower level. However, this warmth was accompanied by constant drafts from the opening doors. The back doors were constantly flung open to deliver coal and groceries. The icy street air instantly cooled even the heated kitchen. The cooks worked in conditions of extreme temperature fluctuations every day. The attic rooms where the servants slept had no insulation at all. The thin slate roof offered no protection from the winter frosts and biting winds. Snow often blew right into the cracks between the roof tiles. In the morning, the water in the wash basins was covered with a thick crust of ice. The maids had to break this ice before their morning wash. Fireplaces in the servants' quarters were installed extremely rarely. Even when they were present, the owners strictly limited the amount of coal given to the staff. Servants were allowed to light a fire in their own rooms only in exceptional cases. Heat was considered a luxury inaccessible to people of the lower classes. Therefore, the rooms remained cold from fall until spring. The huge windows in the grand halls also created problems for the staff. Maids had to wash these massive panes with ice-cold water. In winter, rags would literally freeze to the window frames and glass. This work required immense physical effort and patience. The workers' fingers were constantly red and numb from the cold. The humidity in old houses intensified the feeling of constant cold. Thick stone walls absorbed the autumn rains and retained the dampness. The staff quarters on the lower floors suffered from this the most. The staff's clothes never dried completely, remaining damp. This created constant discomfort during hard physical labor. The ventilation system in the mansions relied on natural draft. Huge fireplaces in the masters' quarters drew air from the hallways. This process created a constant flow of cold air throughout the building. The servants were constantly in the path of these icy air currents. It was impossible to hide from the biting wind inside the large house. Even the doors were designed to retain heat only for the aristocrats. Heavy oak panels with thick upholstery protected the masters' quarters. The doors in the servants' quarters were made of thin planks with gaps. They easily let the cold through and offered no barrier against drafts. The architecture itself worked against the comfort of ordinary laborers. It's amazing how people could live in such harsh conditions for decades. They accepted this cold as an inevitable part of their difficult profession. It would be very interesting to hear viewers' opinions on the architectural injustices of that time. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this topic. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to receive more historical facts regularly. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the appalling design of the bedrooms. The lowest-ranking servants were always housed at the very top or bottom of the house. Attics were narrow spaces right under the roof. In the summer, it was unbearably hot there, and in the winter, it was freezing cold. The wind howled through the cracks between the rafters and the old brickwork. Basements were set aside for working with coal and food. Sunlight barely penetrated through the small barred windows. The stone vaults of the basements radiated a grave-like chill all year round. Workers spent many hours daily in these dark labyrinths. The temperature there rarely rose above a few degrees above freezing. The beds in the attics were often made of iron and very narrow. The mattresses were stuffed with cheap straw, which did not retain body heat. There was a catastrophic shortage of thin woolen blankets to keep them warm on winter nights. Servants had to cover themselves with their own old clothes on top of thin blankets. Sometimes they placed heated bricks on their feet to fall asleep. Waking up in such conditions was a true daily test of willpower. They rose long before dawn when the cold was at its peak. The floor was covered with icy condensation that stung the maids' bare feet. Their clothes had frozen overnight and felt stiff to the touch. They had to put on their icy uniforms in complete darkness by the dim light of a candle. Shoe shiners and kitchen assistants worked in the basements. They washed dishes in large stone sinks with icy water. Their hands were constantly in the cold and quickly lost sensation. The stone floors had no wooden planks to protect their feet from the frost. Heavy work boots offered no protection against the cold seeping up from below. The temperature difference between floors created an additional physical strain. Servants carried trays from the freezing kitchen to the sweltering formal dining rooms. Such drastic temperature changes took a toll on the workers' health. Sweat would form on their faces in the warmth and instantly freeze in the hallway. This turned an ordinary workday into a true test of endurance. Storing personal belongings in the servants' quarters was made difficult by the dampness. The paper in rare books or letters quickly became damp. Leather boots were covered with a white moldy film from the constant cold. There was nowhere to dry things as access to fireplaces was strictly limited. Servants grew accustomed to living in a state of constant chill. Attics and basements were lit by tallow candles. They gave off very little light and provided absolutely no heat. Soot from the candles settled on the cold walls in a black layer. The air in the cramped rooms quickly became stuffy and heavy. Opening the small windows for ventilation in winter was simply impossible. Cutting back on servants was the norm, even in the wealthiest families. The masters believed that harsh conditions strengthened discipline and character. Allocating additional funds to insulate servants' quarters was considered unacceptable extravagance. Any complaints about the cold could lead to immediate dismissal. The servants preferred to remain silent and endure these hardships. A life of two worlds was the norm in vast mansions. In one world, huge fireplaces blazed, while in the other, water constantly froze. This inequality was embedded at the most fundamental level of society's structure. Do viewers agree that such treatment was utterly inhumane? In the next chapter, we will learn how workers coped with this dreadful weather. The secret that people pay thousands for lies in the details of everyday labor. Providing heat for the masters placed a heavy burden on the servants' shoulders. Every morning began with carrying enormous quantities of dirty coal. They had to carry heavy coal buckets up steep service staircases. This work was done in cold hallways so as not to dirty the grand reception rooms. An 18-year-old footman named Edward worked at one of the old estates. His face was covered in teenage acne, and metal braces were visible on his teeth. Despite his youth, he performed the heaviest and dirtiest physical labor. Edward carried dozens of pounds of coal from the basement to the upper floors. His hands were always black from coal dust that had seeped into his skin. Cleaning the fireplaces required getting up early and spending long periods in the drafts. The ashes had to be thoroughly cleaned out before the masters woke up. The metal fireplace grate burned the maids' bare hands in the cold. Lighting the fire took a long time because of the damp firewood and cold chimneys. The maids knelt on the icy stone floor in front of the hearth. In the estate's backyard, a large bear was kept in a huge iron cage. The master kept the wild beast solely for the entertainment of his high-ranking guests. An old maid, whom everyone called Grandma, was tasked with feeding this predator. Every morning she would go out into the frosty courtyard with a heavy bucket of porridge. Grandma would slowly approach the cage, feeling the piercing cold wind. A strange, wordless bond formed between the elderly woman and the bear. Grandma looked into the beast's sad eyes and saw her own weariness. Both of them were prisoners of this vast, cold estate with no choice in the matter. She spoke quietly to him, forgetting her frozen hands and soaked feet. In those brief moments of the cold morning, the two lonely souls found a strange comfort. Returning to the house, the grandmother plunged back into her icy routine. She had to carry copper jugs of hot water to all the master bedrooms. The water cooled quickly in the long, windswept corridors of the estate. The maids had to run up the stairs to deliver the water while it was still warm. The cold air burned their lungs with every quick breath. The master's carpets were cleaned outside in all kinds of weather. Heavy woolen rugs were carried out into the snow and beaten with sticks for a long time. Fine dust settled on their faces and hands, mixing with the frosty air. Their fingers cramped painfully from the strain, but they couldn't stop. This exhausting work drained the last of the young workers' strength. Windows and mirrors were polished to a shine with special compounds in cold rooms. The reception halls were not heated until the owners planned to use them. Servants worked for hours in freezing rooms, polishing oak paneling and parquet floors. Their breath turned into white vapor that settled on the cold surfaces. The vast, empty rooms absorbed every last bit of human warmth. Even the food prepared for the servants differed greatly from the master's table. The staff were given simple cold appetizers and stale bread. Hot tea was considered a rare treat, warming them during short breaks. Thick clay mugs held heat for a long time, and the maids warmed their hands against them. These moments of rest at the kitchen table were the happiest time of the day. Fulfilling all these duties required incredible inner discipline. People sacrificed their health to sustain the luxurious lifestyles of others. The invisible labor of thousands of servants kept the vast Victorian machinery running. Their story deserves to be heard and understood by our contemporaries. Like this video to help spread little-known historical facts. What happened next would completely change our understanding of domestic comfort. Stone floors were the main enemy of warmth in domestic spaces. They lined the kitchens, pantries, hallways, and laundry rooms of enormous mansions. The stone drew heat from one's feet instantly, despite thick woolen stockings. One had to stand on such a floor for 16 hours straight. Drafts posed a separate, invisible threat to the staff's health. Gaps in window frames and under doors created a constant influx of freezing air. The wind swept through the long corridors as if through a wind tunnel. The maids' candles were constantly being blown out by sudden gusts. It was practically impossible to protect oneself from this all-pervading cold draft. The heavy entrance doors were constantly being opened to let in various delivery people. Coal, ice, fresh meat, and vegetables were delivered from the very early morning. Each visit was accompanied by a blast of icy air from the street. The corridors on the ground floor never had time to warm up to a normal temperature. The staff were forced to constantly wear thick shawls draped over their shoulders. Washing the stone floors was a real test of endurance. The water in the buckets was freezing, and hot water was saved for the owner's needs. The maids knelt on the wet stone, scrubbing the soapy solution with brushes. Their clothes got wet and clung to their bodies, intensifying the feeling of intense cold. The room took hours to dry out, filling with an unpleasant, frosty dampness. Work in the laundry room was also accompanied by sharp temperature fluctuations. Large copper cauldrons boiled, creating thick, hot steam. However, the laundry room itself was often located in a cold outbuilding with a concrete floor. The laundresses stood in puddles of icy water, while the steam stung their faces. Open windows for ventilation let the winter chill blow directly onto their heated backs. Hanging up the heavy, wet laundry took place in the courtyard in all kinds of weather. Wet sheets froze right in their hands, turning into stiff, icy shields. The laundress's fingers lost sensation from constant contact with cold water. Returning to the house meant stepping back into the drafty hallways. This work was considered one of the hardest in the Victorian hierarchy of servants. Servants' shoes rarely had good insulation or thick soles. Cheap leather boots wore out quickly and got soaked through. They had to be dried away from fireplaces so as not to ruin the stiff leather. Often, servants put on damp shoes in the morning that hadn't had time to dry overnight. This led to their feet being constantly frozen throughout the workday. The absence of carpets in the staff quarters was a strict rule. Carpets were considered a luxury and were intended to muffle footsteps in the master's rooms. Servants walked on bare wood or cold, smooth stone. Every sound of footsteps echoed through the empty, hollow corridors of the basement. The austere surroundings underscored the gulf between the two social worlds. The evening hours did not bring the long-awaited relief from the exhausting cold. The servants had to sit in the cold staff quarters, waiting to be summoned. They mended clothes or polished silverware by dim light. Their only source of warmth was their own bodies, pressed close together. Exhaustion in the cold slowly lulled them into a heavy, restless sleep. These living conditions shaped the unique, resilient character of these unassuming people. They knew how to find reasons for joy even in the gloomiest rooms of the house. Their resilience helped them endure the hardships of endless British winters. How did ordinary people survive in conditions of extreme cold and drafts? In the next chapter, we will learn how they coped with this dreadful weather. The strict etiquette of the Victorian era demanded that servants remain completely invisible. They had to move through the vast house in absolute silence. Special servants' staircases were designed far from the master's bedrooms and halls. These hidden arteries of the house were never properly heated or lit. The staff glided through the dim light, trying not to draw any attention to themselves. The rule of invisibility complicated the performance of even the simplest household tasks. Bringing in coal or clearing away ashes had to be done before the masters awoke. Maids worked in dark, freezing rooms at dawn in complete silence. If the master entered a room, the maid had to disappear immediately. Any unnecessary interaction with family members was considered a gross violation of the chain of command. Winter evenings required the staff to remain constantly present in the cold corridors. Footmen stood for hours at the dining room door, awaiting orders. They could not move or rub their frozen hands together to warm them. Drafts from the huge windows blew against their motionless figures from all sides. Maintaining perfect posture in the cold was part of their strict professional training. Invisibility meant no right to express physical discomfort. A servant could not show that he was cold or tired after a long shift. Sneezing or coughing in the presence of the masters was punished with severe fines. They had to suppress any signs of illness through sheer willpower. The ideal employee was perceived as a silent and flawless mechanism of the household. The staff's clothing also adhered to strict rules of visual inconspicuousness. The maids' black dresses blended into the dark walls of the service corridors. The thin fabric of the uniform offered no protection whatsoever against the constant drafts. Wearing warm, colorful shawls over the uniform was strictly forbidden by house rules. Appearance was valued far above the comfort or health of the average worker. A system of secret doors in the walls of the reception halls was ubiquitous. Through these invisible passages, servants would suddenly appear with food or firewood. Behind these doors lay narrow, icy passageways leading to the kitchen block. Upon opening the secret panel, the footman would feel a sharp drop in the ambient temperature. Returning behind the panel meant returning to a cold, unheated world. The masters often had no idea of the suffering endured by their servants. They lived in a warm cocoon of carpets, fireplaces, and heavy drapes. The invisible staff ensured this comfort at the cost of freezing every day. Social distance prevented the aristocrats from taking an interest in the daily lives of ordinary workers. The cold outside the drawing rooms remained an abstract concept for the wealthy. Waiting in the carriage was yet another ordeal of cold and invisibility. The coachman and footmen sat for hours on open box seats while their masters made social calls. The winter wind and snow pierced right through their woolen overcoats. Going downstairs to light a fire for warmth was strictly forbidden by the rules of propriety. They had to maintain the house's dignity while freezing motionless on the street. Night shifts required staying awake in dark and cold lobbies. The doorman sat by the front door, ready to greet late guests at any moment. The fire in the hall was extinguished at night to save precious coal. Their only salvation was a thick overcoat and constant movement in place. The silence of the mansion at night was broken only by the howling of the wind in the chimney flues. The requirement to remain invisible deprived the servants of basic human warmth. They were denied a voice and the right to basic physical comfort. Their entire lives were governed by a strict schedule dictated by the desires and needs of others. This invisible facade of Victorian luxury concealed countless quiet personal tragedies. An era of great achievements was built upon a foundation of silent and cold labor. What if everything you were taught is outdated and needs to be reevaluated? The morning rituals of Victorian servants were a true test of human endurance. The day began long before sunrise during the coldest part of the night. The junior maids were the first to wake up to stoke the stoves in the kitchen. They walked through icy, dark corridors, lighting their way with dim candle stubs. The water in the pipes of old mansions often froze on cold winter nights. Melting the ice was the first and most urgent task for the kitchen staff. The maids had to heat water in small kettles over the faint flame of a candle. The frozen valves burned their fingers like red-hot metal in a forge. Only after the pipes had thawed could they begin to boil the large kettles. Breakfast was prepared in bitter cold until the stove had warmed up. The cook's hands grew numb as they cleaned the icy vegetables in cold water. The metal pots and pans stung with cold at every touch. Thick clouds of breath hung in the air of the spacious kitchen area. It took several hours before the massive cast iron stoves began to give off heat. Delivering hot water to the master's bedrooms was a race against time. Maids carried heavy copper pitchers up long, drafty staircases. Any delay meant the water would grow cold, and the master would be displeased. They had to move as quickly as possible, risking a slip on the smooth stone steps. Steam from the water settled on the girls' faces in fine, cold droplets. Preparing the mistress's bath required numerous trips with heavy buckets. The bathrooms were located far from the kitchen, where the water for washing was heated. The cold porcelain tubs instantly drew the heat from the water poured into them. The maids had to constantly add boiling water to maintain the desired temperature. Meanwhile, the workers themselves stood in uniforms soaked through with splashes. Lighting the fireplaces in the bedrooms required exceptional silence and care. Servants knelt to clear away yesterday's ashes, trying not to make their tools creak. A draft from the chimney blew icy street air right in their faces. Lighting damp firewood with a single match under such conditions was a true art. Frozen fingers often wouldn't obey and dropped small pieces of coal. Ironing the mistress's morning newspaper was a mandatory and rather strange ritual. The paper had absorbed moisture overnight and felt cold to the touch. The footman ironed the pages with a special warm iron in the cold ironing room. This was done so that the ink would not stain the Lord's hands at breakfast. The heat from the iron was the footman's only source of warmth that morning. Clearing the front porch of snow and ice was part of the morning duties. Messenger boys or junior footmen performed this work in the biting wind. Brooms and shovels slipped in the numb hands of the young household workers. They had to finish before the first random passerby walked by. The reputation of an impeccable household was maintained at the cost of frozen fingers and constant colds. The servants' own breakfast was eaten in a hurry in the cold servants' room. Hot porridge quickly cooled in clay bowls on a wooden table. The fatigue from the morning rush mingled with a constant feeling of chill. This was only the beginning of a long, grueling 16-hour workday. Ahead of them lay hard labor with no right to proper rest. The daily morning feat of these people long went unnoticed by historians. Their grueling routine was the foundation upon which the era stood. How difficult was it to stay healthy under such constant conditions? In the next chapter, we will learn how they coped with this dreadful weather. The servants' clothing was austere, uniform, and completely impractical. Victorian fashion for domestic staff was dictated by aesthetics, not comfort. The women's uniform consisted of a thin, dark-colored cotton or linen dress. Underskirts were worn underneath, which provided little warmth in the winter. White starched aprons and bonnets completed the look of the ideal neat maid. The fabrics used to make the uniforms were cheap and did little to retain heat. The thin calico was blown through by the slightest draft in the mansion's long corridors. Using thick wool for work clothes was considered an unjustified extravagance on the part of the owners. The maids froze even when moving quickly up and down the house's many staircases. A warm shawl was permitted only in exceptional cases with the housekeeper's permission. The men's livery was more elaborate, but no less cold. The uniforms were made of stiff broadcloth, which restricted movement while working. Thin silk stockings reaching to the knees did nothing to protect their feet from the cold. Tight-fitting doublets made it impossible to wear an extra warm shirt underneath. For the sake of a handsome appearance, the footmen sacrificed their health every winter day. Footwear was a separate problem for all estate workers. Shoes with thin leather soles froze instantly on the stone floors of the kitchens. Special work boots were often purchased with deductions from their already meager wages. They were rough, stiff, and rubbed the feet raw until they bled. Drying such boots near the stove was forbidden due to the risk of ruining the cheap leather. The servants' nightwear was also not designed to retain body heat. Simple cotton nightgowns offered no warmth in the freezing attic rooms. Sleep caps helped retain a little warmth, but not everyone wore them. Servants often went to bed in their day clothes to stay warm in any way they could. The constant cold prevented them from getting a good night's sleep and recharging their strength before the next shift. Outerwear for going outside was a rarity among the lower-ranking staff. Coats were expensive, and many maids wore out old, moth-eaten clothes. Their one day off a month was often spent indoors. Going out into the freezing street in a thin dress meant a guaranteed severe cold. The limited wardrobe effectively made the workers prisoners of the vast cold estate. Washing the uniforms was a complicated process that exacerbated the problem of the cold. Clothes took a long time to dry in the cold laundry rooms, taking on the smell of dampness and soap. Putting on a slightly damp dress on a cold morning was pure torture for the girls. Ironing uniforms was permitted only with slightly warm irons to save coal. The sensation of damp, cold fabric against their skin haunted them all day long. Gloves were not part of the standard wardrobe for most ordinary servants. The hands of cooks and laundresses were constantly exposed to icy water and lye. Their skin cracked in the cold, becoming covered with painful wounds that took a long time to heal. Ointments and creams were unavailable, so ordinary mutton fat was used instead. It softened the skin slightly but did not protect against the biting cold of the hallways. Housekeepers and butlers dressed better and warmer than the other staff. Their high status allowed them to wear thick woolen dresses and fine suits. They had their own rooms, where a small private fireplace often burned. This difference in clothing underscored the strict internal hierarchy of the mansion's staff. The junior servants looked at them with envy, dreaming of a warm woolen cardigan. The uniform was a symbol of belonging to the household, and at the same time, a tool of control. It stripped away individuality and forced people to endure hardships for the sake of maintaining a facade of prosperity. Strict rules of etiquette allowed no compromise between aesthetics and human health. Uncomfortable, cold clothing was as much a part of the job as endless cleaning. Patience and submission were the chief virtues of the Victorian working class. The kitchen in a Victorian estate was a zone of extreme temperature contrasts. A massive cast iron stove radiated unbearable heat right in the center of the room. Cooks and kitchen hands worked in conditions of constant, exhausting heat near the cauldrons. The air was thick with steam from boiling broths and roasting meat. However, beyond this hot island, biting drafts and intense cold reigned. The layout of the kitchen block always included an exit to the inner courtyard. This door was constantly being opened to deliver food or remove accumulated trash. The icy winter winds swept unhindered into the heated room dozens of times a day. Cooks experienced sudden temperature changes as they moved from the scorching stove to the workbench. This alternation of heat and cold took a heavy toll on their already weakened health. Pantries for storing food were always designed on the cold north side. They had no windows or were lit by narrow slatted openings under the ceiling. The temperature in the pantry was only slightly higher than outside to preserve the meat. The cooks had to spend long periods there, selecting ingredients or sorting through vegetables. They would emerge from the pantry chilled to the bone, despite the heat of the main kitchen. Dishwashing took place in the so-called washroom, an annex with stone walls. The sinks were carved from cold stone that never warmed up completely. The dishwashers worked knee-deep in an icy puddle that had pooled from the work surfaces. Their hands alternated between hot soapy water and icy water. By evening, the joints in their fingers would swell severely and ache unbearably from the strain. The ice houses were another area of extreme cold on the kitchen grounds. Huge blocks of ice were delivered in winter and stored in deep cellars beneath the house. Going down to the ice house for fresh butter or cream was an unpleasant duty for the younger servants. Darkness, dampness, and a temperature close to the freezing point of water reigned there. Breath turned to steam, and fingers instantly lost the ability to bend. Pastries required work in a cool room away from hot stoves. Kneading short crust pastry or whipping cream could not tolerate excess ambient heat. Maids performed this delicate work on marble tables in cold rooms. The stone drew heat from their hands, forcing them to work as quickly and precisely as possible. To create the perfect dessert for their masters, servants would stand for hours freezing over the pastry tables. The kitchen window often remained slightly ajar, even during the harshest winter frosts. Thick smoke from imperfect stoves and the smell of burning required constant, intensive ventilation. A constant cold draft formed near the window, blowing against the workers' legs. Sore backs and aching knees were the kitchen staff's constant companions. They couldn't close the window as they risked suffocating from the stove fumes. The kitchen staff's lunch was always a hurried affair at a rough wooden table. They sat as close to the stove as possible to warm their frozen feet even a little. The food was simple but hot, providing a brief respite during a hard day. During these moments, the kitchen filled with quiet conversation and the clatter of wooden spoons. But as soon as the master's bell rang, the brief respite ended immediately and forever. At night, the stoves were extinguished to save precious coal until the next early morning. The kitchen cooled rapidly, turning into a room just as icy as the hallways. The stone floors and walls quickly released their stored heat into the surrounding cold space. The kitchen boy on duty slept on a bench near the cooling stove, covered with a thin woolen blanket. By morning, the temperature inside was almost the same as outside on the snow-covered street. The kitchen was the heart of the vast estate, but it was a cruel heart. It demanded total dedication and incredible physical endurance from every worker. Heat and cold worked in tandem here, wearing people down year after year. It's hard to imagine how they managed such a workload without modern comforts. Their daily labor was a true feat in the name of sustaining Victorian life. The invention of the wire bell system forever changed the lives of British domestic servants. Before that, servants waited for instructions in adjacent rooms where they remained in relative warmth. With the advent of the bell system, the staff were banished to remote, cold corridors on the lower floors. Rows of bells labeled with room names were mounted on the wall in the servants' hall or kitchen. A sharp ring could sound at any moment, day or late at night. The bell mechanism was designed so that the ringing would continue for a sufficiently long time. A spring swung a metal clapper, giving the servants no chance to ignore their master's summons. At the sound of the bell, a footman or maid had to drop whatever they were doing. They immediately ran up the icy stairs to the room from which the signal came. Delay was punished with fines or a harsh reprimand from the head butler. The need for an instant reaction left the servants no time to throw on warm clothes before leaving. They would dash out of the sweltering kitchen straight into the mansion's windswept galleries. Running up the stairs caused them to break a sweat, which instantly cooled in the draft of the upper floors. Upon reaching the master, the servant had to breathe evenly and appear completely unflappable. Any signs of being out of breath were considered bad form and a sign of poor training. Often the summons meant performing a mere trifle, such as bringing a forgotten book. The Lord might ring simply because the fire in the fireplace had gone out. The servant had to make a long journey through the cold house for the sake of a trivial errand. On the way back, the servant would often hear a bell ringing from a completely different part of the vast estate. The running through the icy corridors never stopped for a single spare moment. Night calls were particularly exhausting due to the pitch-black darkness and bitter cold. Servants were awakened in the freezing attics by the sharp, terrifying ring of a metal bell. They pulled on their icy shoes and lit a candle with fingers that were uncooperative and stiff from sleep. Moving through the vast, pitch-black house required the utmost caution and attention. Drafts would blow out the faint candle flame, leaving the servant alone in the darkness. The bell system created constant psychological tension among the entire staff. They could never fully relax, not even while sitting by the cooling kitchen stove. Waiting for a call turned into torture by the cold and uncertainty throughout the long evening. Their muscles remained constantly tense, ready for a quick dash up the stairs. Nervous exhaustion compounded the physical fatigue caused by constant exposure to low temperatures. Installing the telephone lines required drilling into the walls and creating numerous small holes. These technical channels became an additional route for drafts to penetrate the house. The wind swept through the voids in the floors, creating a constant, quiet hum in the hallways. The architectural integrity of the building was compromised for the sake of convenient, rapid communication between the aristocrats and the servants. The cold found new ways to penetrate the workers' rest areas. Waiting by the door after the bell rang was yet another test of endurance. The footman stood in the dark hallway until his master deigned to notice him. Opening the door without a specific signal of permission was strictly forbidden by the rules of strict etiquette. The minutes of waiting on the stone floor dragged on incredibly long, drawing the warmth from his feet. Immobility intensified the sensation of cold, stiffening the young footman's entire body. Repairing the broken bell wires fell to the estate's own workers. This work often required crawling through dusty, unheated attics and utility niches. The metal wire cut painfully into his frozen hands as he tried to pull it tight. Maintaining the comfort system was, in itself, a dirty and cold task. The servants repaired a mechanism that brought them nothing but endless fatigue and suffering. The bells became a symbol of the master's total control over the servants' time and space. They turned the enormous house into a single mechanism, subject to the will of a single wealthy man. This mechanism worked flawlessly, relying on the silent obedience of the freezing servants. A network of wires bound the warm reception halls to the icy servants' quarters forever. The technological progress of the Victorian era often had a reverse, very harsh side. The true luxury of the Victorian aristocracy lay not in gold, but in warmth. The ability to maintain a comfortable temperature in vast rooms was a sign of the highest status. Fireplaces in the living rooms burned continuously from early morning until late at night. Tons of expensive coal, delivered and carried by hand by servants, were used to stoke the fires. Heat was considered a commodity that had to be displayed to guests as proof of wealth. The master's bedrooms were warmed in advance using special long copper hot water bottles. Maids filled them with hot coals and carefully placed them between the cold cotton sheets. This procedure spared the aristocrats the unpleasant sensation of damp and cold bedding. The maids themselves then returned to their frozen beds in the dark attic. The contrast between caring for others' sleep and freezing themselves was striking. The master's baths represented a true triumph of comfort over the harsh British weather. The water was heated to the perfect temperature and generously scented with expensive floral oils. Soft, heated towels awaited the mansion's owners on special stands near the fireplace. At the same time, the staff washed their faces with ice-cold water from jugs broken that morning. The right to hot water was strictly regulated by one's social standing in society. The owners' winter walks were also accompanied by the utmost attention to keeping them warm. Special bricks, heated on the kitchen stove until they were almost red hot, were placed in the carriages. They were wrapped in thick woolen cloth and placed under the feet of the noble passengers. Meanwhile, the coachman on the box had to make do with only a multi-layered overcoat and thick mittens. The comfort of some people was directly ensured at the expense of other members of society freezing. Heavy velvet curtains on the living room windows reliably protected the aristocrats from drafts. These expensive fabrics absorbed the cold air streaming in from the huge stained glass windows. Special draft stoppers were placed under the cracks of heavy oak interior doors. Service quarters were never equipped with such devices to conserve precious heat. The wind blew freely through the living quarters of the house, encountering no textile barriers. Winter gardens and greenhouses required enormous amounts of coal to heat the exotic plants. Orchids and palm trees were kept in a warm, humid climate year-round without interruption. Gardeners spent the night near special stoves to maintain a constant high temperature. It is surprising that the plants received more warmth and care than ordinary people. Plants were considered valuable property, while servants were an easily replaceable labor resource. The owner's thick, warm clothing stood in stark contrast to the servants' thin uniforms. Aristocrats wore furs, thick wool, and layers of high-quality silk undergarments. Their wardrobe was better adapted to the climate than the clothing of those who performed physical labor. The aesthetics of luxury required the presence of expensive, warm fabrics in the daily lives of the masters. Servants remained merely a backdrop, with no right to basic necessities. Huge libraries and studies were heated even when no one was there. Maintaining the temperature was necessary to preserve the expensive book bindings and paintings. Valuable items were protected from dampness far more carefully than the health of ordinary workers. Footmen dusted these warm rooms, enjoying brief moments of physical comfort. But these moments ended as soon as the daily thorough cleaning of the premises was completed. Illnesses caused by exposure to the cold were rare among the masters and common among the servants. Aristocrats could afford to stay in a warm bed and call a good doctor. Servants often faced immediate dismissal without severance pay or references if they fell ill. They endured fevers and severe coughs while on their feet, continuing to perform their duties. A worker's life hung by a thread due to the slightest draft or damp shoes. The heating system in a Victorian home was a perfect reflection of class inequality. Physical comfort was concentrated at the top of the pyramid at the expense of a foundation built on human labor. The warm facade of the British Empire was sustained by the icy hands of thousands of nameless estate laborers. The history of these houses is a story not only of architecture, but also of social injustice. Understanding this fact forces us to take a fresh look at the romanticized Victorian era. Behind its majestic facade, the Victorian era concealed harsh trials for the service staff. The daily lives of ordinary laborers, forced to endure constant cold, command immense respect. Their resilience and unseen labor made the aristocrats' luxurious lifestyle possible. What topics from the hidden everyday history of past centuries would you like to see in future videos? Suggest your ideas in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes.